Earl Thompson had spent the last 15 years of his life in the remote woods of Washington state, living in solitude, far from the bustling world. His cabin, tucked between the towering Douglas firs and rugged hills, was his sanctuary. The stillness of the forest was like a melody to his soul, and he had grown accustomed to the gentle whispers of the wind, the rustling of the trees, and the occasional bird call that broke the silence. It was a life he had chosen after Margaret, his late wife, had passed. The pain of her loss had driven him to the quiet, the solitude, a place where he could reflect on the years they had spent together and perhaps heal. Rusty, his loyal golden retriever, was his only company. The dog, now 13 years old, had been with him since his teaching days, and though his legs had begun to slow down and his muzzle was streaked with gray, Rusty still had the same spark in his eyes, the same wisdom that came from years of companionship. They were a team. Earl, the man who spoke to the forest, and Rusty, his ever-faithful sidekick. It was one crisp fall morning when Earl first noticed the bear. He had stepped out onto his porch to enjoy the early quiet, his breath clouding in the chilly air. The mist from the forest hung low, draping over the trees like a soft, gray veil, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the occasional crackle of fallen branches. Earl was brewing his coffee when a sudden movement caught his eye. A black bear, not far from his porch, cautiously foraging through the underbrush. Earl was no stranger to bears. He had seen them often, wandering near his cabin, but they were typically shy creatures, more interested in avoiding humans than interacting. This bear, however, seemed different. It didn't flinch when Earl looked in its direction. Instead, it paused for a moment, its dark eyes locking onto his. Earl was aware of the moment's significance. He had always believed in the magic of the wilderness, that animals understood more than most people gave them credit for. And as he stood there, with his coffee in hand and Rusty by his side, he couldn't help but feel that this bear was trying to tell him something. Slowly, cautiously, Earl opened the cabin door, deciding to take a chance. He went to his small pantry and retrieved some scraps of food, leftover fish from his last meal. He knew bears were often hungry this time of year, especially with the coming winter. Quietly, he placed the food outside, just at the edge of his porch, hoping to offer the bear something to ease its hunger. That he stepped back, allowing the bear space to approach. At first, the bear seemed hesitant, sniffing the air before inching closer. It was cautious but not fearful, and soon enough, it began to eat, its massive body low to the ground as it feasted. Earl watched, a sense of satisfaction filling him. He had never been one to shy away from interacting with animals, but this was different. The bear was no longer just an animal in the woods. It was a living being that had connected with him. And with that, Earl Thompson, an old man in a cabin, had unknowingly set the stage for an extraordinary exchange, one that would blur the lines between human and animal, friendship and survival, and lead to an unexpected gift the very next day. The morning that followed was colder, the kind of winter morning that seemed to linger in the air even before the sun had fully risen. Earl was already awake, as was his habit, savoring the silence of the forest with his coffee in hand. Rusty lay beside him, the old dog's breathing slow and steady. The fire crackled softly in the stove, and the scent of pine from the forest outside filtered through the cracks in the walls. It was a quiet, almost magical moment, a slice of peace before the world fully woke. Earl had just taken a sip of his coffee when he heard it. A soft knock at his door. It was so quiet, he almost questioned whether it was real. It came again, a gentle thud, not like a human knock, but distinct nonetheless. Rusty, as if sensing something unusual, raised his head from his paws and looked toward the door, his ears perking up. Curious and a little bewildered, Earl slowly set down his cup and stood up, his creaky joints protesting the movement. He opened the door with a cautious hand, expecting perhaps a deer or some small animal, but nothing could have prepared him for what he saw. There, standing in the doorway, was the bear. It was the same black bear that he had fed the day before, but this time, something was different. The bear wasn't just standing there. It was holding something in its mouth, something large enough to be noticed from the doorstep. Earl's heart raced in his chest as he stared at the bear, not sure whether to be afraid or astonished. Was this a dream? A trick of his mind? The bear's eyes were calm, almost knowing, and it did not move as Earl stood frozen in place. It simply waited for him to respond. Rusty, the ever-loyal dog, growled lowly from the corner, but Earl gently waved him down. This was no ordinary encounter. "Hey there, friend," Earl said, his voice soft, not knowing if the bear could understand him. But there was no hostility in the bear's stance. It just stood there, patiently, waiting. Slowly, Earl stepped aside and opened the door wider. To his surprise, the bear walked in, its massive frame filling the doorway. It gently placed the object in its mouth on the wooden floor inside Earl's cabin. It was a large, polished stone, smooth and almost shiny, as if it had been carried from the riverbank. The stone had an almost otherworldly glow to it, catching the light from the cabin's fire. Earl was speechless. The bear didn't just accept food, it had brought something in return. An offering. Earl bent down, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the stone. As soon as his fingers brushed the cool surface, he felt something shift within him. A deep understanding, almost spiritual. The bear was acknowledging something between them, something that went beyond words or actions. The bear stood by, watching him carefully, then took a step back and sat down in the doorway, as though it expected Earl to take the stone and perhaps understand its meaning. The bond, Earl realized, had deepened beyond a simple exchange of food. This bear was returning the favor with a gift, as if to say, "Thank you for helping me when I was in need." Earl carefully placed the stone on the table. The bear, seeing the man's silent appreciation, turned to leave. It didn't rush, didn't look back. It simply walked away, disappearing into the forest as quietly as it had arrived. As Earl watched the bear disappear into the trees, he couldn't help but feel a mixture of awe and confusion. What had just happened? Had the bear known the importance of a gift? Had it intended for the stone to be more than just a gesture? Earl couldn't answer, but the feeling that had washed over him was undeniable. The bear had acknowledged him, and in return, had given him something that seemed far greater than mere food. That day, Earl found himself sitting in his cabin, staring at the stone for hours. He pondered the meaning of the bear's gesture and what it might represent. Could it be that animals were more aware than people realized? Could the wilderness truly speak in a language that humans could understand, if only they listened? The rest of the day passed in a quiet daze. Earl went about his tasks, chopping wood, feeding his chickens, but his mind kept returning to the stone and to the black bear that had knocked on his door. The bond between them had shifted, and Earl knew that he would never look at the forest or the animals within it the same way again. Days passed, but the stone never left Earl's thoughts. He often found himself staring at it, turning it over in his hands, wondering what it meant. There was something so incredibly deliberate about the bear's actions. It had not only accepted his food, but it had also reciprocated, giving something back that was far beyond a simple thank you. It was as if the bear knew, somehow, that the exchange wasn't just about survival. It was about connection. A connection that transcended species, time, and even words. Earl had always felt a deep connection to the natural world. It was part of the reason he had chosen to live alone in the wilderness after Margaret's passing. He had always known that the forest, the animals, and the rhythms of the earth spoke to him in ways humans couldn't comprehend. But now, as he examined the stone, something new stirred within him. This wasn't just some random gesture. The bear's gift had meaning. The stone itself was smooth and polished, unlike anything Earl had ever seen in the forest before. It wasn't the kind of rock that would naturally appear near his cabin. It had clearly been chosen with care. Its glow seemed almost mystical, catching the light of the cabin fire in such a way that it almost seemed to pulse with energy. Earl had never believed in such things as magic, but in this moment, holding the stone in his hand, it felt like he had stepped into something far greater than himself. He began to think back to the times Margaret had spoken of the magic of the woods. She had always been the one to see things through a lens of wonder, to find the beauty in the ordinary. Earl had often teased her about it, calling her fanciful. But now, as he stared at the stone, he understood what she had meant. The world was full of mysteries, and some of them couldn't be explained by logic alone. As the days went by, the bear continued to return. It wasn't every day, but whenever Earl least expected it, he would find the bear standing near the edge of the clearing, looking at him with those knowing eyes. Sometimes the bear would bring something, another stone, a branch shaped like a perfect heart, or a bundle of wildflowers carefully arranged. Each time, Earl felt a deep sense of gratitude and awe. The bear had become a kind of messenger, a guide between the human world and the wild one. At night, Earl would sit on his porch, playing his harmonica. It was an old habit, one he had developed during his years with Margaret. She had always said that the music seemed to call to the forest creatures, and though Earl had never believed it, now he wasn't so sure. As the wind carried the sound of the harmonica across the clearing, the bear would often appear in the distance, just standing at the edge of the trees, listening. It wasn't that the bear understood the music, Earl knew, but it felt the rhythm of the wilderness that the music created. It was a bond that stretched beyond human comprehension. Earl realized that the gifts the bear had brought were not just offerings, they were messages. The bear was showing him something that he had never seen before: the possibility of communication, of friendship, between two species that had always lived on opposite sides of the divide. And perhaps, just perhaps, this wasn't just a gift to Earl. It was a gift to the bear as well. The bear had brought it back, a stone from its world, to show Earl that in this vast, wild place, they were connected. As the months passed, the bond between Earl and the bear only deepened. It became a ritual of sorts. Earl would leave food for the bear, and the bear would return with gifts, each one more thoughtful and more meaningful than the last. Earl began to realize that the bear had not just come to his cabin out of hunger or curiosity. It had come because it had recognized something in him. It had seen that Earl was different from other humans. He wasn't afraid of the wild. He respected it, and he understood its rhythms. One afternoon, as Earl was mending the roof of his cabin, he heard the familiar sound of rustling in the brush. He looked down, expecting to see the bear once again, but this time, something was different. The bear wasn't alone. It had brought two cubs with it, small, adorable creatures that playfully darted around, their ears oversized for their little bodies. The bear mother kept a watchful eye over them, her protective nature clear as she stood nearby, observing. Earl smiled. The sight of the cubs reminded him of the time he had spent with Margaret, watching wildlife together from their porch. He had never felt as connected to the wild as he did in these moments, watching the bear and its cubs from a distance, feeling as though he was part of something much larger than himself. As the cubs grew bolder, Earl began to interact with them. They were curious, playful, and full of energy. Every now and then, the cubs would wander up to his porch, sniffing at the steps and looking for any leftover crumbs or treats that might be lying around. Rusty, the old dog, had grown more accepting of the bear family's presence. While he was still cautious, he had come to understand that the bears were no threat. They were just part of the wilderness, like everything else. Rusty even started to share his favorite blanket with the cubs, laying beside them while they napped, their tiny bodies curled up against his. It was clear that the bear had formed a kind of unspoken friendship with Earl. There was no fear in its eyes, no aggression. Instead, there was trust. The bear had learned to trust Earl, and in return, Earl trusted the bear. They had entered into a kind of silent agreement, an understanding that both had their place in this wild world, and neither would overstep the other's boundaries. One evening, after the cubs had left, the mother bear returned alone to the clearing near the cabin. She sat down at her usual spot, not far from Earl's porch, and stared at him. It was a quiet, serene moment. Earl could see that the bear was content. She had made peace with the fact that she and her family could coexist with humans, even if only at a distance. And for the first time, Earl realized that perhaps the bear had come not just to show gratitude, but to teach him something about the world he had never understood before: the importance of harmony. The forest had always been a place of mystery. For Earl, a place that had been both his sanctuary and his teacher. And over the course of his interactions with the bear, he had come to understand that nature had its own way of communicating, its own rhythm, and its own magic. Earl had always known that there was more to the world than meets the eye, but now, in the quiet companionship of the bear and her cubs, he understood that there was a deeper connection between all living things. As the months passed, and the bear's visits became less frequent, Earl found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. He had lived in the wilderness for so long, but he had never truly understood its secrets until the bear had entered his life. Through the bear, Earl had come to see that the wild was not something to be feared or controlled. It was something to be respected, something to be understood, and something to be loved. In the final weeks of winter, Earl sat on his porch, playing his harmonica as the sun set behind the mountain. Rusty lay at his feet, and he couldn't help but think of the bear, of the trust they had built, the gifts exchanged, and the bond that had formed between man and beast. And as he played the last notes of his tune, he heard a familiar sound, a low, distant whistle coming from the forest. It was the mother bear, standing at the edge of the trees, just as she had done so many times before. Earl smiled and played one final tune on his harmonica, and in that moment, he knew that the world, this wild, beautiful place, was full of stories waiting to be told. Stories that bridged the gap between humans and the creatures who shared the earth with them. And, for the first time, Earl Thompson felt like he truly belonged.